What are the things that you can do today to try and identify any spots where there could be issues that you can try and rectify now? Again, we've got a pretty wide audience for this, so I'm not going to try and say that this is going to be for one select group of you folks. There are going to be things that apply toward ShipBob customers. There are other folks who are going to be that are going to apply to people who are either directly integrating with Shippo or even with their own carriers. But there are things you can do, such as, we've talked earlier, find a way to simulate a spike. It just so happens here at Shippo, we have a concept of something called a test API token. This is a way for you to exercise our APIs without invoking the cost of actually generating a label. So it's a great, easy button to press if you're trying to simulate a large load going through your system, but you don't have to worry about, going through the whole process of getting a whole bunch of labels refunded, that sort of thing. So it's a great way to kind of, do a bit of a pressure test on how your own flows are working. I would suggest though, if you do go down that route, please coordinate with your Shippo team. And I assure you, if you're going to be testing at that kind of volume, you will have a Shippo team associated with you. Just coordinate with them and make sure they're aware of the fact that you're getting ready to do that, just so giant alarm bells don't start going off because we start seeing increased volume because maybe there was fraud or something like that on the back end. Another one is, when you're doing that kind of volume testing, rate limits are a thing, right? So when you're interacting with carriers, when you're integrating even with Shippo, there are limits to how fast, how many, calls you can make to a given API endpoint. Be aware of what rate limiting tier you're on. It just so happens that we've got a very good partnership with ShipBob. ShipBob is actually at the highest rate limiting tier that we have at Shippo. So rest assured, if you're going through Shippo, you're going to be having the best experience you can on top of the Shippo platform. But be aware of what those rate limits are and make sure that you're identifying what you can do inside your own systems to ensure that the throughput of API calls that you're doing are going to be below those rate limiting tiers. Um, Now, we mentioned this a little bit earlier. Know those cutoff times. When it comes to manifesting, if I generate labels for my packages and it's time to generate a manifest, I'm not going to immediately be able to hand all of those packages off to my UPS truck driver or my FedEx truck driver. So understand not only how long it takes for you to go through the automated and digital processes, but even know what your human workflow looks like. How long does it take on average for us to get the bins to the loading dock so that those things can get on the truck so I can hand that scan form off to the driver and know that I'm done for the day. So identify those, do some dry runs to understand what those look like. And again, like Francesca was talking about earlier, have metrics on these things. If you don't already, start looking at what you can do to invest on tracking how long it takes for these things to go through your system, because at the end of the day, it's going to make your overall processes go smoother and result in fewer shipping errors and fewer customer support calls. When it comes to things like carriers, again, we're not trying to pick on any given carrier, but the fact of the matter, again, thinking about failure modes, carriers sometimes have issues too, right? So when you are trying to meet an SLA, like you're doing next day delivery or 2-day delivery, and all of a sudden the carrier that you tend to integrate with is no longer able to generate labels, what's your failure mode here? Or do you have a plan in mind for, okay, this may be a slightly more expensive service level on a different carrier, but we know it's going to meet the service level that we've got with our customers. So we're going to go ahead and fail over to those just to make sure that we're meeting our own customers' expectations. Uh, Likewise, when it comes to things like address validation, a lot of the time we have customers that only perform address validation, verifying that the source and destination addresses on a package are actually valid at the time they go to generate a label. If you've got any way to take that pressure off your system and do those in advance, I highly recommend you look into that. And by the way, this is where, people like me, your Shippo Solutions architects, can come in. I'm here to talk to you and help identify, what we can do to help you modify those workflows so that you and your customers have a better overall experience. Um, Again, when it comes, and this is more oriented towards people who are like in the digital world, if you're actually calling APIs to automate the processes, be always thinking about what will this code do in the event that it gets an error. If I try to generate a label and I get an error message back from when I try to generate the label, is my code set up to where it's going to retry to generate that label? Or worst case scenario is your code doesn't handle that error well and it just drops that transaction on the floor, which means you're going to have a very unhappy customer because they don't understand why they didn't get their package after they pressed the buy button. Likewise, think about what you're going to do with retries. How you can't sit there and incessantly retry if it consistently keeps giving you an error. Maybe there's something wrong with all the parameters that you use to generate that label. It may be time to escalate that and let a human being take a peek at that while you proceed to choose through the rest of the backlog that you have. And then again, like Francesca mentioned a little bit earlier, make sure you understand what the processes are for troubleshooting. Get to know your account teams, get to know what the SOP is. A customer's calling and they're saying they're not seeing tracking data for a package. How do you know whether or not that package actually got on the truck? How do you know whether the label even got generated? Understand what the phone numbers and email addresses are. And one of the things that I actually recommend you do is like do a test package. Ship a package, just pretend as if there's an issue with it, and go through that process. Make sure you know who to reach out to find out the information about the state of that package, and understand, this is my SOP for actually, identifying and troubleshooting an issue that I may have in that shipping experience. I talked earlier about things like, simulation. When possible, if you can set up like a sandbox environment to test these things, that is fantastic. Not everybody's got the resources to do that sort of thing. So, like Francesca mentioned earlier, try to run like events. I mentioned Amazon earlier. There are not a lot of people that realize this, but Amazon runs Prime Day as a test for the peak shipping time between Black Friday and the end of the year. So when you see Prime Day sales goes on, that is Amazon pressure testing their own systems. Again, they are so large they can't possibly simulate it, so they do it in production with that slightly lower pressure environment of Prime Day. When possible, if you've got metrics that are keeping track of what's going on in your system, build a dashboard. Have something on the wall that shows you whether or not you're meeting your average throughput, how long it's taking to get a package picked and packed and sent off to the truck. If you don't have those kind of metrics, start seriously looking at what you can do to add those. And it doesn't require, like a really advanced piece of technology. You could have it to where it's something as simple as running a stopwatch a couple of times a day just to verify what your throughput looks like in the human world. And then the last one, that I wanted to mention is, identify the things you can do. I talked about carriers failing. Sometimes, like say again, we're going to beat on USPS a little bit here. Sorry, guys. But if you use them as your default carrier and something starts happening, does it require a human being to go and modify something in your system? If so, that's awful because that means it's going to take a long time for it to get fixed because us human beings are slow and we're unreliable. Whenever possible, look at ways that you can use automation. Have rules in place where it's like, hey, look, if I can't generate a label within 30 seconds, it's time for me to cut over and start sending it through UPS or FedEx. So start thinking along those lines for what you can add to your system to make it more reliable and as close to self-running as possible. And with